Okay, so we're recording. Okay, and I'm going to record on my computer too.
Welcome to a new episode in our series Archetypal Cosmology. Today, Professor Dr. Glenn Perry. Hello, Glenn.
Hello. Hello, Volker.
You were 16 years old in a supermarket doing your business, and then you came about a book written by Sidney Omar. Sidney Omar, one can Google and find in Wikipedia, was a rather famous American astrologer for the rich and famous. Did you know who he was when you bought the book?
You know, I don't recall. I think I probably did, because at that time, Sidney Omar was it was a common name. We had newspaper horoscopes. We still do. I don't know what happens outside of the United States.
Oh, we do
I
that
know
too.
in England, you do in Germany as well?
They have as well.
So in America, we had newspaper horoscopes, and Sidney Omar was the astrological newspaper horoscope famous guy.
He
But
was
he also had a series of books,
yes,
apparently. And
50
this is
million books sold, and he was the main astrologer of the Los Angeles Times.
That's right. Yeah, that's right. So I was in the supermarket buying something when I was about 16, and I was just in the checkout line, and I saw these series of books on sun signs, all by Sidney Omar. You could choose any one of 12. So I picked up the one for Cancer, and the reason I picked it up is that not only it had supposedly predictions for the year, but it also had a description of the sun sign, and I had never read anything about my sun sign before. So out of curiosity, I bought it, and it was one of the most amazing things, I think, up until that point in my life that I'd ever read. It was like, boom, fireworks. It's like the lights went on. Suddenly I was able to see in print words that described the personality that subjectively I knew was true. I felt it to be true. I mean, I sort of always had a sense of who I was, but to see it in print so clearly described, using, a whole variety of phrasings, it was astonishing. And I was sort of immediately convinced of the validity of astrology, and was surprised that it wasn't being taught in schools, because, here I was in high school studying math and science and English and history and all the usual subjects. And I thought, wow, this is so valuable. Why is this not being taught in schools? And I think probably without my realizing it at that point, I think the desire to teach astrology in an academic setting probably was born, but I certainly didn't know it at the time.
Okay, so you finished high school and you went to Florida for college. Why Florida?
Well, I was on the track team, and I was a javelin thrower. And at the time, the University of Florida was one of the best track programs in the country. Jimmy Carnes was ultimately became, in my senior year there, the United States official track coach for the United States Olympic team in Munich. And so it was a fantastic track program, and that was my main interest at the time.
It was sports. You were a sports college student mainly.
Yeah, I went there on an athletic scholarship.
Okay. So did you study anything else besides sport?
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, you can't major in sports, as much as I might have liked to.
Okay. So what did you study?
I was actually, the plan was to go into business with my father after graduation. So I was studying business administration with a specialization in marketing, but I had no interest in the topic. It was almost symptomatic of this kind of enmeshed Sun square Neptune relationship that I had with my father at that particular time in my life, really up until that time in my life. By the time I got to be a senior, I had matured enough that I realized that I was not an extension of my father, and he wasn't an extension of me. And I began to differentiate and realize what it was that I really was interested in, which was a lot of things that had more to do with psychology and actually astrology too, because I had continued to study sun signs of friends and family members and my academic professors and anybody that could give me their sun sign. So I was sort of indirectly continuing to deepen my understanding of the signs. by the time I got out of college, I, I not only was I interested, and I knew I was interested in philosophy and mysticism and comparative religion and paranormal and all those topics, but I also was interested in writing. So
How did
I
that come about?
I was just always kind of in love with film, and there was a lot of shows in the '60s, Outer Limits and The Twilight Zone, and shows on the paranormal, and that was really always the thing that grabbed me the most. So I decided I would go to Hollywood, California, and just I wanted to study screenwriting. So that's what I did. I went to Hollywood I was in Hollywood for 3 years studying screenwriting, but I
Not
was
so fast, not so fast. When you decided you wanted to study screenwriting, is there after college you call it postgraduate studies for screenwriting in California?
well, I suppose there are, and I actually considered going back to school for it, but at this point I'm on my own, and I didn't have any money, and my parents weren't going to finance it, so I just studied on my own. And
Okay,
oh,
where did the money come from? What did you do for a job?
I had a variety of odd jobs. I was working as a waiter mainly, and then I got into a print agency, and I was doing modeling, male modeling. I was doing like magazines and car commercials and clothing commercials and things like that,
Sounds
advertisements in print. And
sounds
so
like
I was actually making pretty good money doing that. And the nice thing about it was that it was part time. So they paid you a lot of money, and I only had to work a couple hours a week.
what,
So
what,
the rest of the
what
time
exactly
I worked. Pardon?
what exactly was it what you were doing for getting paid quite an amount of money? What did you do really, factually?
Oh, it was just you stood there and they took you to various locations. Like I was actually on the back lot of Universal Studios, and we were doing a Honda car advertisement, a magazine layout. So we would dress up and in that particular shot as Germans actually. You know, we were sort of like, well, it was either that or Switzerland. I can't remember, but it was. I actually was on the location where they shot Frankenstein, and that's where we did the original film of Frankenstein. And it was just, it was a lot of fun doing that kind of thing. So that's what I was doing.
And that was in Hollywood, in Los
That was
Angeles.
in Hollywood, yeah.
Uh,
Well, Hollywood was where I lived, but I think Universal Studios at that time was down in Studio City, which is all part of Los Angeles.
okay, so in that time you were earning money part time, and in
Yeah.
the free time, what did you do in your free time?
Well, I was just reading. I was just studying and reading. It was almost like a postgraduate self-study
Okay,
program. And
okay,
I was wanting to read and educate myself in material topics that I then planned to incorporate into screenplays to make a film or
okay.
sell a screenplay. And
And
so I was
how did that?
studying the paranormal, and I got into studying reincarnation with Edgar Cayce and mystical systems like the Rosicrucians and comparative religion and reading a lot of philosophy. And
What did you read in the Rosicrucian side? The Heindel literature, or
yeah, it was Max Heindel.
it was Max
Yeah,
Heindel? Okay.
yeah, Max Heindel, and I forget who else was involved with that. I mean, it was sort of I did a little bit here, a little bit there, and I was also studying things like psychic discoveries behind the Iron Curtain, where there was all this really interesting stuff going on with the paranormal and
And if I
legacy of
remember this
clairvoyance.
right, in one of your interviews, you're mentioning Tarot and I Ching. Is that right?
Yeah, I was interested in all the oracular divinatory systems like numerology, tarot, the I Ching, and astrology, but mostly astrology. And
Okay.
after 3 years of doing a lot of studying, I was taking some classes in astrology, and that's when I think I really realized I wanted to do astrology professionally and
Was that
began to
was
take
that
clients.
was that in Los Angeles, in Hollywood? The
Yeah, that
classes?
was while I was still, in fact, funny story, when I first moved to Hollywood, I ended up living on a place called Hightower Lane, and I've been told that there was a place there for rent. And it turned out that the woman that told me about the place said you had to go up in this elevator, and then you had to walk down this little sidewalk, and it was up above Los Angeles, looking down into the Los Angeles basin. And she said, "Find the house with the seven dwarfs." I thought she was kidding. She said, "No, I'm serious." She says, "Find the house with the seven dwarfs." And she says, "Right, knock on the door, and there'll be a little woman that lives there, and she'll take care of you and show you the place that she has for rent." So I did. I found the tower, and I went into the tower, and it took me all the way to the top. There's only one stop, which is the top, and then wound my way down this little sidewalk of gingerbread houses. It was like a little fairy tale land. And I found the house with the seven dwarfs, knocked on the door. This beautiful gray-haired woman answered. It turns out she was the original voice of Snow White in the Walt Disney film, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. And she was the woman that rented my place, which was right across from hers. And I looked into her backyard, or not her backyard, her side yard, just above the Hollywood Bowl in Hollywood, where she had the seven dwarfs. And that's where I stayed. That was my place in Hollywood.
And this first course in astrology, who was the teacher?
A guy named Robert Pike, Bob Pike.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, probably. He never actually officially wrote a book, but he had an unpublished book that we all studied, and he was my first teacher.
So how long did that education in astrology in Hollywood last with this teacher?
I was taking classes from Bob for probably about a year, maybe a year and a half.
Okay.
And then I started actually seeing a few clients. And then I was also interested in psychology, and I ended up getting this little part-time job on weekends where I was working in a counseling center. But I was really just sort of administrative, long story, and it's not worth going into. But I would be the person who would sort of like manage all the clients that were coming in to see the various therapists. And
what sort of
in their schedule? They were just, to tell you the truth, I don't know what type of therapy they did.
Okay.
Whether it was, psychoanalytic or humanistic.
Okay.
But I got to know a lot of them. And in the course of getting to know them, I started thinking, geez, I could do this. How do you get to be a therapist?
Okay.
Because I was wanting to integrate astrology into psychology, get some good training in counseling skills, because I kind of felt like I was over my head with the clients that I was seeing. They were breaking down and crying, and they had like real problems. And, here I am just looking at the chart and didn't really have any idea what to say to them beyond what I had sort of memorized in terms of what planetary positions meant and so forth. I had a pretty rudimentary, simplistic understanding of astrology at that time. So, I found myself in this counseling center and realized I could go back to graduate school. Well, not go back, but go to graduate school for the first time. And that's when I met the man that became my teacher, a guy named Richard Eidemann, who had come down to Los Angeles from Northern California to do a weekend workshop at the home of Zipporah Dobbins. And I had bought Zipporah Dobbins one of her books. She was a PhD clinical psychologist and also an astrologer. And so that was really exciting to go to her house and take a weekend workshop with this man, Richard Eidemann, who was teaching astrology to a graduate program in Sonoma State up in Northern California. So I went to the workshop, I met Richard, we sort of clicked. And I think I just realized this is the guy that I really need to study with. So I moved up to Northern California, ultimately enrolled in a graduate program called Lone Mountain College, where I was starting my master's degree program after about a year and studying with Richard simultaneously. So I was from the start.
This master's studies, was this psychology?
Yeah. It was in the license that I was going to get was a license in marriage, family, child counseling, what we called MF, at that time MFCC, now it's called MFT. But you learn how to do individual, couples, and family therapy.
So to let me get this straight, the Stanley Krippner comes later.
Yes. Yeah.
So
That was after Lone Mountain College,
okay.
which was a 2-year external degree program. And so I finished those 2 years, another year of study and preparation, internship, well, longer actually, probably 2 years. And I had to get 5,000 hours of counseling, supervised counseling experience, part of which I got working in a residential treatment center for emotionally disturbed adolescents. That was the work that I was doing during this time. And then I got my license. Well, I took the exam. It was a written and oral exam and passed and got my license, started private practice. And it was then that I realized I wanted to go back and get a PhD. And that's when I went to Saybrook Institute, also in San Francisco.
So could I say that Krippner was the mentor for your doctoral thesis?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, he was. He was my chair of my dissertation committee.
Did you get him know well?
Yeah, we were friends. We actually lived in the same town, Fairfax, California. So we hung out a lot, actually.
It's not difficult to say that Richard Eidemann and in astrology and Stanley Krippner in psychology are two giants. So you were standing on the shoulders of two giants.
I was really fortunate. It was a good place to be, actually.
So let's talk about Professor Krippner a little bit. Who was he? What was he like? Being already famous at the time, or later.
He was just a very sweet guy, very nice man. Obviously, really, really intelligent, and had his huge background of information. So he had Moon and Sag, just like I do, and he also had Sun and Libra. So, unlike me, he had a lot more charm, and everybody loved Stanley. He was just a really thoughtful, considerate, kind, generous person with his time, and absolutely dedicated to probably, I would say, more transpersonal psychology, because he had this very broad kind of understanding of what psychology could be. So he sort of straddled humanistic and transpersonal and paranormal psychology with a big interest in dreams and mythology, Neptunian topics.
That sounds like there could be some connection to Esalen and Stan Grof.
Yeah, there was actually. In fact, I went down to Esalen with Stanley for a weekend workshop, and I guess it was a weekend. I don't know if it was a workshop. It was a gathering of Michael Murphy, and I don't remember if Stan Grof was there at the time.
How about Richard?
But there was a lot of Richard. I don't know if Richard was there at that point, or he was maybe he was there and I didn't meet him. But there was Charles Tart was there. I don't know if you know who he is. He was teaching at the University of California. He was big name in paranormal psychology at the time.
So let's try the timeline to get this straight. When you were 16, the first book of Sun Sign. Then with 17, high school finish, right?
Yeah.
Then 4 years of college in Florida.
Uh-huh.
So you're 21, and you were born 1949 for our listeners.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
So with 21, you start jobbing in the Hollywood surroundings, and you have this part-time jobs, and you study screenwriting. How about that? That got lost. No.
Oh yeah, right.
Screenwriting anymore?
No. I mean, what happened? I was studying screenwriting, but I was, as I say, I was mostly interested in what I was interested in studying. Paranormal psychology and transpersonal and the occult and reincarnation, all those different things that I had already mentioned. And so astrology really became, I think, dominant in my interest. And I just decided I wasn't going to continue to pursue screenwriting.
Okay.
My passion for astrology really took precedence. So it was at that point I just sort of like my path
Yeah.
bifurcated, and I went north and decided to go back to graduate school. And my interest in film never really waned, but it's sort of like if I had two lives, I would do that one too. But you got to make a choice, and so that was the choice.
When you started this graduate school in the first graduate school, not in the Saarbrück Institute, but before that, you were 24?
No, I think it was probably more 22, 23 probably when I started Lone Mountain College.
And that was 5 years?
No, that was 2 years. 2 years, and then another year or two after that, preparing for my exams, my
master.
The licensing exam for the state of California to get an MFT license. And then I was maybe a year after that, I was probably 25, 26 or so when I decided to go back to graduate school. And maybe it was later, hard to remember. Maybe I was 27, 28.
Okay. And what was your doctoral thesis, the theme, what you were working on?
It was on the evolution of consciousness. I called it Mutations of Consciousness, a systems perennial approach to the evolution of psyche. I was really trying to understand what's the nature of the universe in which astrology works. How does astrology fit in to the nature of the universe? And so that was really my quest.
And in the internet information about your personality, one can find the two words perennial philosophy. When did you start that?
I think that was really during my graduate studies. Yeah, at Saarbrück Institute. There's a book by Aldous Huxley, and then from there I kind of branched out into a number of other authors. But the perennial philosophy, what I liked about it is it was an amalgamation, a synthesis of all the great metaphysical, spiritual, and religious traditions that had unfolded over the course of human history. And the perennial philosophy extracts the core ideas, the core principles of these different traditions and synthesizes them. And that was really kind of the way I thought about religion, as there were different pathways or approaches or models, but the concepts we have about God are not the same thing as God. And that was at the heart of the perennial philosophy. And it said that, there's different ways we can conceptualize and think about the divine, but we have to understand that there's a difference between what is ultimately knowable and what we can merely intellectualize about. So that approach really spoke to me, and that in combination with general systems theory, which was almost like the perennial philosophy in the field of science, because it's a scientific language that's cross-disciplinary. You can use general systems theory to understand physics, biology, chemistry, psychology, sociology, and so forth. And it's this umbrella model that provides a conceptual framework for understanding how all living systems operate. And so when you combine that with the perennial philosophy and use it to sort of as a theoretical background for understanding how astrology works, which is itself a systems theory in a way, you can understand, in other words, astrology as a general systems model. I was off and running. So,
do you recall? Did you ever hear the name Thomas Ring when you were studying?
Thomas Ring.
Yeah, that's the main German psychological astrology theory. Never came about.
No, I never did, unfortunately.
And about the perennial philosophy, any names, books you read?
Yeah, there was, well, as I say, the perennial philosophy by Aldous Huxley is sort of the Bible.
Oh, okay. So you didn't go back like Agrippa von Nettesheim or Paracelsus or Hermetic scripture, something like that?
I was studying a lot of Manly Palmer Hall. I'm not sure I'd really call him, I mean, you could say that he's a perennial philosopher. Then also, of course, Ken Wilber. I was studying a little bit of Ken Wilber, and David Roy Griffin, a guy in Claremont College down in California, also wrote a lot of books, although he wouldn't call himself a perennial philosopher, but I would.
So
Um,
basically, what you mean with perennial philosophy is people you studied having written books, more contemporary authors, and not the old ones. So the perennial philosophy you learned was already there, done by other
yeah, it
people.
was like I think a lot of the work that really needed to be done to look at the old authors and old spiritual texts. And Houston Smith was another one.
Oh, okay.
Smith, who wrote a book called The Forgotten Truth. I remember. But yeah, so I was sort of like, benefiting from the groundwork that they had already done.
Okay. So Richard Eidemann was rather affiliated with Liz Green and Howard S. Porter. Did you ever meet those two?
Yeah, yeah, I did actually. Liz and Richard, I forget why Liz came out, but it must have been sometime in the 80s.
She
She was,
came
of course,
together.
she was really close with Richard because they had done a series of workshops together.
Yes.
And so I met Richard and I met Liz at some event that she and Richard were putting on in San Francisco.
Oh.
And then I met her many times after that when I went to trainings that she and Richard did together.
To
Uh,
London? Did you go to London?
no, I did go to London much later, and I taught at CPA,
Yeah, okay.
uh,
Center
Center
for
for Psychological
for
Astrology, which was Liz's school.
yes, right.
But they did a workshop, a week-long training in Virginia. I think it was West Virginia, on chart synthesis. So I think I don't know if Howard was still alive at that point. I think he died in '92, but I saw him at UAC, and I don't, Howard grew up in West Hartford, which was just a couple of miles away from where I grew up. We knew some of the same people, so Howard and I knew each other for a while, and I don't remember exactly where I met him for the first time. But of course, he died of AIDS in, I think, as I say, 1992.
So Richard Edelman, uh, if you had to characterize his philosophical background and his astrological background, what were the geniuses on the shoulders he was standing?
Richard was an original. I don't really think, well, I think that he initially was enamored with, as was most people at that time, Dane Rudhyar, back in the 60s.
Okay.
Because Dane Rudhyar had been doing a lot of writing and really got popular in the 60s, although his initial book, I think, was written in 1936 or so. Anyway, so I think Richard started off, but then sort of, Rudhyar was really only superficially psychological, even though he called himself a humanistic and is sort of like the poster child grandfather, I suppose, of humanistic astrology. His understanding and commitment to to psychology, humanistic psychology, was fairly thin, whereas Richard really picked it up and incorporated it in a much deeper, I think, more sophisticated way into the kind of astrology that he was teaching, but even more so with Jung. And Rudhyar's understanding and utilization of Jungian psychology in his astrology was, again, fairly superficial, whereas Richard and, of course, also Liz later were integrating Jungian psychology and astrology in a more, I think, comprehensive and sophisticated way.
So if you look at your own biography, when Richard died, you write in or you talk in the Chinese interview, which is available on the homepage glenperry.vonabiswelt.de. I will put the link below this video. You talk about that when he died, you felt like he gave you the task to fulfill his mission because he didn't write that many books. He didn't write any books.
Yeah.
How about that?
I don't know, I don't know if I put it that way. I don't really think Richard ever said anything like that to me.
No.
That
But
was
you
not.
said in the interview to your Chinese students,
Yes.
I get it here. He was like an older brother to me, and with Richard's death, I was transformed from student to teacher and began writing about astrology as a tool for transformation. before that, with Richard's passing, there was also a passing of the torch, a sense that I inherited his legacy and had to carry it forward. Your way.
Yeah, that was how I felt. I want to make that clear. It's not like Richard said, you're the chosen one, carry on. It wasn't, it was more just like I felt like it was a transitional moment for me. I remember transiting Saturn was on my moon in the 8th house, just conjunct my moon when Richard died. And there was a sort of sense of, at that point, that was 1988. So I was still working on my dissertation, or just starting to work on my dissertation, because I didn't really get out of Saybrook until 91. But I was already starting to write and lecture in astrology, and whether Richard passed or not, that would have happened, but it seemed to correlate with that Saturn transit, where I felt more ready, I suppose, more mature, like I'd done my homework. And since I was no longer his student, since he was not around anymore for me to learn from. So I had to sort of pull together what I had learned from him over that 12 years that I knew him. And, I had already done a lot of that already. My master's thesis was largely, organizing all the material and information that I had learned from Richard, along with what I had learned during my master's program in psychology. So I was continuing to build on that over the years as I went through my doctoral program. And by the time Richard died, I felt like it was ready for me to start to teach.
Let me come back to Richard Idemann's postgraduate studies in astrology, you said. Is that right? He had a school where he was teaching and people got an academic degree?
No, who is this?
Richard Idemann.
No. I think he called what he did the School of Astropsychological Studies. I think that was the name. But he was just basically just freelancing, teaching some classes, once or twice a week in San Francisco, as he had been for the entire time that I knew him, and was doing even before I knew him. So it wasn't a real school in the sense that you got a degree or anything like that.
When you were with Richard those 12 years, was there any graduate school or astrological school around in those days?
No, there wasn't. Not that I knew of.
So the first would be CIIS and Kepler.
Yes.
Kepler came about 2000, I think, right?
Yeah. I mean, Kepler was a real school, a real academic program.
Yes.
And there was nothing like that before. I mean, there was like NCGR certification programs and things like that, but there was nothing that even remotely resembled an actual academic program where you could get a degree or a diploma, something like that. I think probably AFA, American Federation of Astrologers in the United States, provided correspondence courses. So there were those kinds of things that you could get.
But they had
nothing like a real.
And they had no official state or government, federal government or state government
exactly.
Nothing
right.
like that.
Exactly.
How did you come about CIIS, and what is CIIS?
Well, CIIS was the California Institute of Integral Studies. And I forget exactly when it started, and it changed its name a couple of times.
It started in the 50s. The very origins are Sri Aurobindo. The people who are watching this can look up our playlists, and they find these stuff with Richard Harner's playlist. But they changed the name, and Robert McDermott took over.
That's right. Yeah.
90s.
Yeah.
And I don't know when they dared to integrate something like archetypal cosmology, which is a rather step to getting critics.
Yeah, they didn't. I mean, archetypal cosmology didn't really. The term didn't even exist until maybe 2009. You know,
So
when
2 years after Cosmos and Psyche came out.
yeah, yeah,
Okay.
exactly. That's when a group of scholars that were sort of working with Richard Tarnas were starting the Journal of Archetypal Cosmology, and Kieran Legris and Richard and Stan Groff and James Hillman all wrote these seminal articles in the initial publication of the Journal of Archetypal Cosmology, and that was, I think, in 2009.
Yeah.
And so, but Richard was doing he had it was a doctoral program, I believe, at CIIS back in the 90s, and I don't exactly remember when that started, mid 90s maybe, where it was called Cosmos, Culture, and Consciousness. I think that was the name of the program. I apologize if I'm getting that name wrong, but it was something along those lines, you know, consciousness, cosmos, and culture. And you know, I don't think they had formally been teaching astrology, but Richard and I knew each other, and we both knew. I had been publishing the Journal of Astropsychology throughout the 90s, and I had published a number of his articles in it, and so we got to know each other that way. And then at some point, I guess on the basis of my own writings, he wanted to have me. He asked me if I would teach at CIIS a course in astrology, psychological astrology, and so I did. That was in, I think, '97, and I taught there for 3 years. I did 3 years of teaching in psychological astrology to students that were in his program, Cosmos, Consciousness, whatever it was called.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So let's go back a little bit. You just mentioned you were the editor of the Journal of Astropsychology.
Yeah, I was the publisher of it. Okay. I mean, I had started it.
When did that come about? We go back.
I think that was, you know, that was right after Richard died. That was like back in '87.
'87. That's when before your dissertation. You know, that was before your dissertation.
Before my dissertation, yeah, yeah.
How does one start a journal? How do you do that?
Well, it was like, you know, computers were just starting to come into their own, you know, personal computers, and there were software programs, and you could actually create, you know, a really nice layout and have your logo and pictures and print and text just like a newspaper. And so you just do it. And then I went to a printer and gave them, you know, the text, the software folder document, and they printed it out. And so they would print out like, you know, a couple of hundred copies, however many people I had subscribing.
And how
and I got subscribers from the internet. You know, and to tell you the truth, I'm going, well, how did I get subscribers? Because we didn't even have email back in those days. You know, I think I'd advertised in various astrological journals.
Oh, okay.
You know, and
so
you know, there was the ESAR journal, and NCGR had a journal, and I was a member of NCGR. Psy-Sig, I think, was called the Psychological Special Interest Group. And so this was going to be sort of like the journal for the NCGR Psychological Special Interest Group. So they, in a sense, I could advertise through them, and then people would write to me and they'd say, well, I want to get it. And so they would go on my list and get their address, and I would just mail it off to them whenever I got a particular issue out.
And the title was Journal for Astropsychology.
Yeah, I think initially it was the Astropsychology newsletter, and then I changed it to the Journal of Astropsychology.
How did the title Astropsychology came about? Was that Richard?
I think so, yeah. I was thinking, well, what do I do? You know, and Richard and also there was another fellow in Europe.
Bruno Huber.
Bruno and his wife.
Louisa.
Yeah, and they were also using the name astropsychology. And they were both, along with Richard, trying to find ways of integrating astrology and psychology. And so I liked that term, astropsychology, more than just psychological astrology. I think it had more, to me, it felt a more sophisticated, serious attempt to integrate astrology and psychology together. So in that tradition, I used that name for the journal.
Okay. And Richard and Louise and Bruno Huber, they did know each other personally or just by letters?
No, they knew each other. Bruno and Louise and Richard knew each other very well. And in fact, I think Richard had gone over to Europe and Bruno and Louise had organized some workshops that he was teaching.
Was that the World Conference? We had this astrological World Conference.
That's right. Yeah, the World Conference
in Lucerne and in Zurich and things like that.
That's right. Yeah. And I had actually, after Richard died, there was the Lucerne Conference that I had gone to. That was like in what, 99, something like that, 98, somewhere in there.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you went to Switzerland.
Yes.
And what did you do on the conference?
I gave 2 lectures.
About?
One was on, trying to remember, plutopathology, the psychology of sex, death, and power. And then the other lecture, I'm not sure what it was on. I'm not remembering.
How about your German? Do you understand German?
No.
So you were on the World Conference where three quarters were all in German. And
yes,
you were
they were translated. But the articles, the lectures that the English-speaking lecturers gave were all translated.
Yeah, but you didn't get a translation for the German ones, right?
No, I don't know if we did or not. I don't think so.
So how about people you met there? Did you meet Reinhard Stiele, the publisher of Germany?
I don't recall that I did meet him.
Okay. How about Nick Campion?
Oh, sure. Yeah. Well, I'd known Nick for a while.
Oh, okay. So, when did you meet Nick the first time? Nicolaus Campion, the professor in the Sophia.
Well, he was always getting invited to UAC and other American astrological conferences. So probably somewhere back in the early 90s, I think, because there was UACs at least since 1987 that I was going to. Or 1989, I think, was the first UAC that I went to. 1986 was the very first UAC, so the second one I went to, and I think that's probably where I met Nick. I'm sure it was because I think he won a UAC award at that particular conference.
And how about Nick Campion's astrology and Glenn Perry's astrology? The same, or what are the differences?
Well, I think what we have in common is an interest in rigor, academic rigor, as applied to astrology. But of course, he's more interested in the history of astrology, not really in applied astrology, actually working with clients.
Well, so that's not true. He did work with clients. Then he had a 10-year pause, and then since '95 he did again take clients. So there must.
Oh well, so that's news to me.
Did you talk about his astrological approach? He published a book about astrology for practice, the practical astrologer. Any discussions between the two of you about what you do, what he does?
Not so much. No, I think we last time I saw Nick was in India in Kolkata last January, and we had a couple of nice conversations about the state of astrology, especially with regard to its lack of academic rigor, and something that he had really, probably more so than anybody, was championing in the work that he was doing at Bath University, and really bringing a much more scholarly approach to astrology than I think anybody has ever done. So that's I think what we share a common interest in that, but not so much in necessarily the way he works with clients or the way that I work with clients.
Bath Spa University in England, close to Bristol, and the Lampeter University in Wales. Do you know the background stories, the kitchen stories about all that?
I don't I don't know actually. Probably, I'm sure, much more that I don't know than I do know.
Okay. Well, I'm trying to get Nick Campion on the series, so let's see whether he's willing to talk about the kitchen talk. There's quite something around it because Bath Spa University was flowering, and somehow the flowering stopped, sort of, and then the astrology in academia sort of transferred to Wales, Lampeter University. But that's nothing you would know about.
I have a dim recollection of a big transition that occurred in some of the politics.
Yes.
There were political things that were going on that I think probably helped to bring that ending and new beginning or rebirth about. But I don't know the details. I can't recall them anyway. I mean, I think he wrote about it at some point, or I might have read an article at some point. But probably there's a lot more to it than I can recall.
If you take the impression you got from Nick Campion and his approach to rigor and astrology as an academic field, is there anybody else of that level of importance besides Nick Campion in your biography when you met astrologers?
I mean, other astrologers that were interested in doing serious academic work?
Or astrologers which impressed you deeply because they were very interesting astrological personalities? Both.
Yeah, well, I think that the Richard Tarnas, I think, is somebody that I have a lot of respect for, and Ciaran Lagrice, the work that he's done. He wrote a book. Oh God, I can't remember the name of it, but it's.
No, the recent one is Jung on astrology.
Pardon?
The recent one is Jung on astrology.
Jung in Astrology by Liz Green.
No, Lagrice did a book by himself with.
Oh, he has.
Yeah.
Oh, I wasn't aware of that.
There are 3 books: 2 by Liz Green, Jung on astrology, and 1 by, I can't pronounce his name. And
yeah, I'm probably butchering her too.
And so, who else did leave an impression on you about astrology or rigor in studying astrology? Those were the few?
Yeah, I would say so. In terms of, again, bringing a kind of real serious evidence-based scholarly approach to astrology.
Okay.
That there's not. I mean, I can't say that there aren't other people. I'm sure there are, and and it's not just in psychological astrology. I think Robert Hand and Demetra George and others that were associated with Kepler College were also really serious about doing the historical research and bring again some academic rigor to uncovering astrology's past. But it's fairly thin pickings as far as academia and astrology is concerned, and that's a very steep hill to get up. And there's a few people that have made some inroads into that, but it's still very much, I think, to the extent that we'll ever be fully accepted and honored inside academia, we're just at the very beginning stages, I think.
Okay, let's talk about academia. I have, after my profession as a lawyer in the government in Lower Saxony, I did 12 semesters studying, trying to do a doctoral thesis in astrology and law, and I published it. I failed in the exam, but the book is still available. How about your experience with academia? My experience is not so that I would say, Jesus, these people are real good people. My experience with academia is, Jesus Christ, what the fuck is going on here?
What do you mean by that?
Well, the rigor you were seeking one should say, okay, rigor means openness, asking questions, not denying anything if it's worth discussing. That is rigor in scientific working.
Mm-hmm.
Try that with astrology and science.
Well,
there is no rigor at all. Those are just theologians like the Catholic Church and saying this is heresy.
Yeah, I think you put your finger on it.
Take, for example, the example of Rupert Sheldrake. That is
Yes.
notorious, like it should not be done. The Magazine of Nature, publishing like The Sun in England. Extremely horrifying. So how about your experience with
I mean,
academia?
with Rupert Sheldrake's work.
Yes, yes.
Yes, right. Yeah.
How about your personal experience in academia? Were you impressed, or did you have the same impression like me?
Well, I was at the time that I went to school, and I think it's a lot different now for a lot of reasons that are partly political, and it gets into other areas that don't necessarily have to do with astrology. I think that academia, at least in the West, in the United States in particular, I can't speak too much for Europe, has really slipped into a kind of decline. But back in the 90s, when I was going to school, and in the 80s, I was impressed. Now, I was impressed in this way, and I want to differentiate it from the point that you're making. There was a method, there was methodology, research methods that I was learning. And I was really kind of excited about that because in the back of my mind, I always wanted to establish astrology as a legitimate academic discipline. And I knew that in order to do that, it had to be approached with the appropriate method. And which was the right method? There was a variety of methods, qualitative and quantitative, that we were exposed to. At Saybrook Institute, it was really much more heavy in the direction of qualitative methodologies, which was fairly new at that particular time. But the idea then was psychology, the study of consciousness, really doesn't lend itself very well to the scientific method because the nature of the method is too narrow. It's too much based on the material world.
Too much statistics, and statistics
and something just can't really be quantified. Because in the quantification of consciousness, you strip it of what its essence actually is, which is intangible and non-quantifiable. So I was really kind of excited about qualitative methods and the kind of rigor in scientific spirit that was brought to bear on studying psychology and consciousness, which was my field of interest, which in my mind included astrology. I really very much thought astrology was a language of consciousness. Literally, probably to this day, the best language of consciousness that exists, at least potentially. So that was kind of my wheelhouse that I was working in. And there wasn't anything going on like that in the field of astrology because it had been divorced, ostracized from the academic world. It was sort of caught in a backwater. That's what it kind of felt like to me. It was just a lot of stuff that was being claimed and published and taught that I found highly questionable and troubling. Things that were being said to clients. And again, I was sort of like coming from a clinical background where there was certain ethical standards that you had to adhere to in terms of how you worked with clients. And it was just nothing like that in astrology. And so I thought that bringing some of that to astrology would ultimately be a really good thing. But I think the point that you're making, which I fortunately really didn't have to deal with very much in the schools that I went to, which is for the most part, academia is wedded to the scientific method in what I would call the mechanistic paradigm, the materialistic mechanistic paradigm, determinism, reductionism, the scientific method, in which, in a sense, the almost religion that prevails within that paradigm is called scientism, where nothing exists that doesn't fall within that framework of the quantitative method of science, statistics, and so forth. And if you can't prove it by that method, it doesn't exist. And so again, within that framework, astrology makes no sense. It doesn't seem to have um, a deterministic causal mechanism for how astrology might work. It's not intelligible within that mechanistic, materialistic framework. And so there's a hostility toward astrology. And that's why it was kicked out of the university. It wasn't compatible with the scientific method that began back in the 17th century. And to this day, to a large degree, especially in the hard sciences, still prevails, although it's softened a lot. So when I was in graduate school, in the psychology program, especially with their openness to the qualitative methods, they didn't really give me a hard time. You know, in fact, I did start off my doctoral program at a different school than the one that I ended up with, Saybrook Institute. And I think after the first year, I had to sit down and have a meeting with the director of the program that I was in and talk to them about, well, what did I think I wanted to do my dissertation on when I finally got to that point. And I said, well, I want to integrate astrology with family systems theory, because general systems theory was wedded to family psychology at that point. So I was learning a lot about general systems theory and seeing how it related to astrology as well as psychology. And I thought, wow, this would be a really exciting dissertation. This is what I want to do. And the guy looked at me like, well, you know, we can't have you do a dissertation on on astrology and family psychology because there's no literature in that. There's no background in that. There's no way we could discern whether what you're saying has any validity because it's never been done before. And I was saying, well, exactly, you know, I'll be the first guy to do it. And they said, well, we can't have that. You know, there's got to be other people that you can quote and references, and you got to build a case. And if there's no authors in astrology that have a psychological background, then, you know, you can't do it by our standards. So I said, okay.
There was at least one. C.G. Jung was a psychologist and did astrology, and he wrote about it.
He did, but, you know, in the way that they were much more narrowly defining family therapy, Jung had no place or credence. So I left the program, you know, and I when I went to Saybrook, I told them when I interviewed, I said, I do astrology and I'm interested in integrating it with psychology. That's what I did in my master's degree program. I probably will want to write a dissertation that incorporates astrology in some way. And if I can't do that here, then let me know up front, because I don't want to spend any time if that's the case. So they said, no, we're open to that. So
was that a risk?
That's when I made my commitment.
Was that a risk for Saybrook, for the official, for the state and government bureaucrats?
Probably. It probably was, or would have been. You know, I mean, they weren't teaching astrology, but they said, if you want to write about it and find a way to integrate it with what we teach, you know, we're open to that. And so I don't think at that point they really felt like they were taking any risks.
How were they teaching it?
Pardon?
How were they teaching it?
No, I said that they weren't teaching.
Oh, they were.
They were not teaching astrology.
Teaching it. Okay.
They said that if I want to incorporate what I know about astrology into what they are teaching, in other words, courses in psychology and consciousness and so forth, that they would be receptive to that. They would allow me to do that. And my professors all did. And so I was very lucky. I was fortunate that, you know, Stanley Krippner being, you know, probably the main one, and he was interested a little bit in astrology because Stanley was interested in everything.
So what happened after you published your thesis? Did they get shit?
No, because I didn't, as it turned out, I was much more interested in, at that point, the evolution of consciousness. And I didn't have to bring astrology into it heavily.
Oh, okay.
No, I did sort of peripherally, but it was really more about evolutionary biology, physics, new physics, Jungian psychology, the perennial philosophy, general systems theory, and consciousness studies. When I sort of wove all that together, and that was
So
my
there was no shitstorm like with the dissertation of Elisabeth Tessier in France on the Sorbonne.
no,
No.
no.
Do you know the story?
I do. I met her at UAC, and she told me.
Ah, okay. Tell us the story.
But the little bit that I know was that she did her dissertation on astrology, and I think I don't remember whether she actually got accepted. I think they
Yes.
wouldn't let her. Did they?
No, she was.
She got the PhD,
She got the PhD. Yes.
but then she was wrongly attacked and discredited
Yes.
following that,
It was
which was very
a
painful for her.
shitstorm as today.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Okay. The last question to California. CIIS is sort of more daring, right?
Yeah, they were really always pioneers.
How do they do that and not getting discredited from the official of offices?
You'd have to ask them that.
Who is protecting them?
I don't know. But after I stopped teaching there, I don't know whether they ever taught astrology again there.
Oh, it's
So
still
maybe
there.
there was some blowback. I don't know for sure.
Okay.
But
So basically, now we are somewhere around 2000, right? You are teaching at CIS.
yes.
Did you start teaching at Kepler College in Seattle, Washington State?
I had given a lecture up there, and Kathy Coleman, this was around 2000, because Kathy Coleman also had been working within the administration at CIIS. She, of course, had long been an astrologer, as was her husband, Ralph Metzner, also one of the sort of key figures in the humanistic psychology movement. So Kathy she had left CIIS and she was president of Kepler College. And so she was beginning to develop or she wanted to develop a psychological branch or degree program, a specialization in Kepler. And so she wanted me to do that. And so she and I were working together and mapping out different courses and so on. And then shortly after that, I got invited up. She invited me up to Kepler to give a talk. And that was a real interesting experience because I was so excited, like finally, because I was very supportive and excited about Kepler College and eager to be a part of it and to bring psychological astrology into the curriculum in building on what I had been doing and developing at CIIS. But when I got there, it was a very, very chilly reception. And that's maybe an understatement.
Okay, Siberia.
Yeah, it was like Siberia, because at this point the traditional, what we was then called and is still known as the traditional revival in astrology, which probably started in the late 80s and then picked up steam through the 90s. It was a reaction against the kind of fuzzy, vague, shoot from the hip, make it up as you go along psychological astrology that I think had emerged out of the 70s and Rudier's work, and then Liz's work, and Richard Eidemann and Howard Susportis and others that were doing psychological astrology, what was called humanistic astrology. It was very unstructured and unsystematic, and it was itself a kind of reaction against the rigidity and the sort of event-oriented fatalism of traditional astrology that had prevailed right up until the beginning of the 20th century. So now in the 90s, the traditionalists were sort of making a comeback, building on the work of Alice Barkley, I think her name was, in England, and then of course the main people were Robert Hand and Robert Schmidt and Robert Zoller, and then of course Demetra George and Chris Brennan later. They were all really excited about reintroducing a kind of structure
In England, it's John Frawley, right?
John Frawley, right. You know, he was the one that Olivia Barclay, I think he built on her work. And so there was this new wave of traditional astrology that had been already firmly established at Kepler College. Demetra George, and there's a few other names that for some reason I'm blocking. They'll come back to me. And so when I got there, and I sort of gave a little overview of the evolution of astrology and how it's, you know, connected to the evolution of consciousness in traditional astrology, and I was sort of saying that psychological astrology is sort of a new evolutionary overlay. You know, if you think about evolution developing in successive layers that incorporate everything that's gone before, but allow something new to emerge out of the previous synthesis. And I could see the faces in the audience, the implication that psychological astrology was somehow more advanced or evolved than traditional astrology was anathema. And so it became really obvious that there was no place or interest in psychological astrology at Kepler College. And they let Kathy Coleman know that, and she let me know it. And all the excitement that we both had, it didn't come to pass. But maybe that was a good thing in retrospect. Things always happen for a reason, because that ultimately led to my developing my own academic program.
How about today? Is Kepler College, after you have been there, didn't they develop a special branch of psychological astrology?
Say it again. Did they develop a branch?
After your personal experience at Kepler College in 2000 or something, didn't they still put the students through psychological astrology?
I think there might have been like a course.
Yes.
In
yes,
it,
yes.
you know.
Obligatory.
Yeah, sort of sort of like, you know, here's all the different kinds of astrologies there are,
Okay.
and here's a course in psychological astrology, but not the kind of entire 2-year program that Kathy and I were envisioning.
So during all this time, you were practicing psychotherapist, right?
Yes, yes.
And that's where you did you earn your income, basically.
Well, that and astrology. I mean, I was doing both ongoing psychotherapeutic work with my clients, and then of course I also did the usual astrological consultation, you know, in the way that I do them.
And in 2007,
and I was teaching, and I was also teaching my own classes from the early 90s.
In your private home, or where did you do that?
Private home.
Private home. Okay.
Yeah.
How many students?
Oh God, you know, it varied, but you know, I would have 20, 25 people in a class. Okay. I actually started teaching at a church in Tiburon, California, and you know, there was like, again, there was 20, 25 people. That went on for a couple of years, and then I migrated it to my home once I had a big enough home to teach in.
This church, was it the Sacred Room where he taught astrology?
Yeah. Well, it was. Did you say Sacred Room?
Yeah.
No, it wasn't in the church proper.
Okay.
It was in a separate room.
Separate room, okay.
Yeah, where they had workshops and things like that, where everybody could sit in a circle.
So you're established, you earn a lot of money with your practice, you teach, and then you decide, I give that all up, California, no more, I go back to the East Coast with the snow. How did that come about?
Well, it's sort of, you know, that turning point at Kepler College was really the start. I had a student. I had developed what I called a mentorship program, which was in 3 parts, and it took about 1.5 years for students to do. And so I was doing that. And one of my students, a woman from Switzerland, had come to California, and she said, well, I'm in California, we should meet. So she was actually an American that was living and had married a guy from Switzerland. And so she and I hooked up, and she said, you know, I'm actually doing a master's degree program at the school in Sonoma. And it's an external degree program. And I'm going to go up there. and I have to have a meeting with the director, and she says, you know, you should probably talk to this guy and get a sense of what he's doing because you might be able to do something similar. And this was like right after I sort of, um, I want to say I was kicked out of Kepler College. I just wasn't welcomed back in. Um, so I did. I went up there, and there was this guy named Mel Sood who was doing this program called the University of Integrative Learning. It was his own creation, and it was actually an accredited school where you could actually get an accredited master's and PhD. And I thought, wow, I mean, I didn't really know that much about how to start a school and what all that entailed and the different legal hoops that you had to jump through, but this guy had done it. And it seemed like it didn't seem that hard. Little was I to find out. I was later to find out that that was an illusion. I mean, it was a lot more difficult than I realized. But I thought, well, if I'm not going to be part of Kepler, why not just start my own 2-year master's degree program or even a doctoral program if I can? So I actually began to work with Kathy Coleman in developing a master's PhD program in astrology while I was also investigating with the laws of California how to get that program underway so that I could be accredited. And at that point, I thought I could really do it. But it was very complicated, and the amount of paperwork and time that I would have to give to that while I was also teaching my own classes, seeing clients, doing some writing, it was just overwhelming. So I realized at some point along the line, I just didn't have time to do it. So I needed to get out from under all the work that I was doing in my psychotherapy practice because I was seeing like 40 people a week at that time, and everything in the field of psychotherapy had become so taken over by the insurance companies. Managed care was the name, and you had to constantly be writing reports on your clients in order to justify continuing sessions, and I hated it. So long story short, I realized I had to radically change my life or I would never have the time to develop my school the way that I wanted to. So I had a really good friend in Connecticut, and we began to talk at some point, and I told him my situation. And he had this property that he wasn't living in, but he had bought the property right on the Connecticut River. He thought eventually he would build on it. He says, I got this house in Connecticut, right on the Connecticut River. It's beautiful. I'll never live there. I'll never rent it out. I'm just going to build there someday. But if you want to just live in that house, do whatever you want to it, fix it up, go ahead.
Old house? Old house, broken house?
It was an old house. It was an old house, sort of an old farmhouse in a sense. I don't know if you call it a farmhouse, colonial house. But it was just as big as the house I was in. It's 3 stories. I mean, it was a pretty big house, 3-bedroom house, right on the Connecticut River, 8 acres of property out in the country. Absolutely beautiful.
I tried.
No rent, no mortgage, nothing.
I did a research of the address of your academy, and all you can see if you go to satellite is green trees. You don't see a house.
Yeah, exactly. Well, if you zoom in, you can see the house. So that's what I did. I made this big change, and I moved to Connecticut, stopped my practice in California, kept my license, and I began to do work with some clients by Zoom. All my clients then became online clients, but I reduced my practice to about 10 to 15 hours of therapy a week as opposed to 40, which freed up all this time to be able to write and to be able to develop my school. So that's what I was doing. And within a year, I found out about a school. It was sort of like almost the sister school. Some of the same people were teaching at the Graduate Institute in Connecticut that had been teaching and continued to teach at CIIS in California. And so I went there and actually saw...
CIIS or Sedoma?
Pardon?
You said they were teaching at CIIS?
Yes, yeah.
Oh,
There were
okay.
some people that were teaching at CIIS. What's his name? Alan Combs, who wrote The Radiance of Being.
Oh, okay.
Alan Combs was one of the main faculty members at the Graduate Institute and also a main faculty member at CIIS. And Rupert Sheldrake was also teaching at the Graduate Institute,
Oh, okay.
and had been invited out in the program that eventually I developed for CIIS called, it was a master's degree program in archetypal cosmology and conscious evolution. This was right about the same time that CIIS had started their journal in archetypal psychology, and we were looking for a name for the program. And so that was like the perfect name because they were really concerned about flying under the radar because they were kind of moving up the accreditation ladder. It starts off with state, then regional, then national accreditation. And so, you know, the guy, Bud Stone, that was the head, the president of the Graduate Institute, was concerned, and we had a meeting, and I made this proposal to him. I said, I can, you know, create a 2-year master's degree program in astrology, and I think there'll be enough astrologers that would like to get an accredited master's degree in astrology. Would you be open to that? And he says, yeah. He says, but we got to come up with a different name. We can't call it astrology because it'll jeopardize our accreditation. And he was a real maverick, and I have to give Bud a lot of credit for taking that leap. But he did, and that was the name we came up with. It was going to be a master's degree program in archetypal cosmology and conscious evolution. Ultimately, it was really just an astrology program, but it integrated a lot of other studies. You know, Neoplatonic theory, the perennial philosophy, new science, history, the history of science, and consciousness studies, psychology, along with astrology, which was its core. So it was the dream program that I had wanted to develop in terms of my own school, but this was in a lot of ways better because all the accreditation already had been done by the Graduate Institute. I just had to become a school within a school. So that's how I ended up doing what I'm doing. But that lasted 3 years, and I don't know if you want me to go on about that.
Yes, I want, because now it's getting interesting. Continue.
Well, what was interesting about that is that about 2 years into the program, every year the New England Association of Schools and Colleges, which is a federal organization that provides oversight to academic institutions to assess the viability of their programs in terms of whether or not they're deserving of accreditation, you know, state, regional, and ultimately national. The Graduate Institute already had state accreditation, so they were accredited to give out master's degrees
for Connecticut.
For Connecticut, right? You know, but regional accreditation is a higher level accreditation. See, and
what does it entail? New York and New Hampshire, or
I think New England. No, if it's more than that, I don't really know. I mean, I'm not really all that.
What does New England entail?
Oh, Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont, Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Rhode Island. So there's like 6 states.
Okay, yeah. 6 very small states.
6 relatively small states, yes.
Okay. How large is Connecticut? From north to south, how many kilometers or miles?
Gosh, you know, I don't know.
Is it 1,000 miles? Is it 1,000?
No.
500 miles?
You can drive it in like 3 hours.
Oh, it's a small state. Okay.
Yeah, it's a small state. The width of it from south to north, you can drive in 2 to 3 hours.
Oh, okay. So they were reviewing the whole thing, and they saw this very.
Where they sort of, you know, opened up the cover, you know, on the archetypal cosmology program and started looking at the course descriptions and what we were actually studying. And they told Bud, they said, "Hey, this is not going to fly. You're not, you're dead in the water if you want regional accreditation and you're teaching astrology. We're not going to give it to you." So Bud had to relay that news to me. And so after 3 years, we had to shut the program down, which, everything is a blessing in disguise, I've learned in my life. I didn't like the feeling of sort of like pretending. And, there was also a lot of things that I had to do within the framework of that program. I didn't feel entirely free to teach exactly what I would have taught if it were completely my own program. I had to make a certain amount of concessions to Bud and to the Graduate Institute. And then there was a lot of other stuff involving administrative stuff that was just tedious. And I was a one-man person. I was teaching all the courses. I was the only person that was like the head of a department and was the only faculty member in the department. So it was a lot of work. But what was really great about it is they had taught me how to sort of navigate and learn online teaching within a real formal academic program. To use what we called in those days, Adobe Connect. It's a little bit like Zoom now, in GoToMeetings and WebEx and all these other online teaching programs, and Blackboard course sites, which is even more sophisticated, where you have the entire curriculum all laid out with each course along with documents and tests and learning guides and links to various other videos, YouTube videos. And the Blackboard course sites was very complex and very sophisticated, but all the major schools were using Blackboard course sites for the platform to present their academic program. And man, to learn all that in addition to online teaching, if I had to learn all that on my own, I don't know whether I ever would have got through it. I mean, I would have had to hire somebody. But as it was, they taught me everything that I needed to know. And at the end of 3 years, when the program was ending, I realized I had this entire program. It was already on Blackboard course sites. All I had to do was migrate it over into my own school, Academy of Astropsychology, and build it out again the way that I want it to be. But I basically learned how to do Blackboard course sites and teach online through the Graduate Institute. So now I have a 2-year diploma program that had I not done that work at the Graduate Institute, I'm not sure really if I would have been able to develop it certainly as quickly as I did.
Considering the fact that this master course was accredited by the state government of Connecticut, is there a chance that your academy gets accredited for state?
Well, if there is, I don't care anymore.
Oh, okay.
I don't want it, I sort of like I've been there, done that.
Okay.
I'm over it. The nice thing about what I do now is that it's in every way like a master's degree program. I mean, maybe not exactly, because I don't require my students to write a long master's thesis, although they write essays all the way through and they take tests and things like that. But essentially, it's a master's degree program. But I'm free from anybody looking over my shoulder and dictating to me and forcing me to jump through a lot of hoops and end up charging a lot more than I can charge a much lower fee, which is affordable to more people. So I'm happy doing it the way that I'm doing it.
And how does this come about that Glenn Perry from Connecticut becomes a major teacher of astrology in Beijing in China?
Oh, well, I just met this fellow named David Rayleigh at a conference that I was lecturing at, it was connected to ESAR, and he and I are sort of the same age and have a lot of shared interests, and we had a really nice kind of brotherly connection. And he had met this woman in China, and they together had started a school called Nodor Academy in Beijing. And David has a humanistic psychological background in psychology, so he was interested in having a more extended or sort of a larger footprint of psychological astrology in the program that they're teaching. So he brought me on board, and at first it was just a course, and then it sort of evolved over the last 4 years into my being, a regular year-long teacher there, where basically I'm teaching my 2-year program to students in China. So basically I've migrated the Academy of Astropsychology program, all of our courses, over to China, and now I'm teaching the program in 2 places.
So basically, to talk about China would be an extra session, not today. How about Turkey? How did you get there?
I just got one of my students from my mentorship program way back in the 90s, I think, a guy named Baris Oskaris, was teaching at a school in Istanbul with Onur Dozer. And so he mentioned me to Onur, and Onur invited me over to Afghanistan, to Turkey, and to Istanbul. And so I taught there for a couple of years.
So that's another session probably. We'll see whether
No, I mean, there's not really much to say there. I think I taught 1 semester at his school.
Okay.
And then I lectured over there twice.
But it's always interesting to learn about the surroundings of other countries, how they do things.
Yes.
Let me ask a last question for today's session, because our 1.5 hours is up, sort of.
Sure.
The ownership of all these institutions, CIIS, is that state-owned or is it privately owned?
I think it's a private institution. It's not like
University
of California branch or something like that. So
how about the graduate school in Connecticut? Is that the
same? Privately funded. Privately funded.
Do you know the people who own the place, or do you know the people who own the place in Connecticut?
Yes. Well, I mean, the people that are the administrators, some of them I know now. I mean, it's been a couple of years since I was involved.
Yeah.
But has sold the school and retired, and so some of the people that were working in the administration are still there.
Oh, okay.
So I know those folks.
So things like that are not that common in my country, because in Germany things like that are normally state organized.
Oh, yeah, mostly state-owned education.
Anything else you want to add for today?
No, I think probably as far as like how I got to be where I am at this point in time, we've covered quite a bit of ground. So
we have on this homepage, where I put the link below this video, you will find all the books available. The availability is a little bit tricky. There's 3 books available via Amazon worldwide, but there are 5 books where Glenn Perry is thinking about doing something that it's easier to get them, because to order a book from America from a private seller is just unbelievable difficult. I tried this. I never do it again. But we talk about this privately, how this can come about.
Yeah, I think that Amazon is working on that problem, but it hasn't been resolved yet.
Well, it's not really a problem if you do it my way. Okay. Thank you for listening to this video, probably the first video of a lot to come. Glenn Perry, the astrologer and psychotherapist in Connecticut now. Thank you very much. And I finished the recording first. This one.
Yeah, thank you, Volker. I appreciate the opportunity to tell my story.
Okay, thanks.